there are roughly three different categories of problems. So the first would be problems that are kind of intrinsic to and perpetual possibilities within democracy. Most obviously, at the moment, the rise of populist, a kind of anti-pluralist forms of politics. But those, it seems to me, are actually symptomatic of a second level of problems which relate to what can be referred to as the sort of hollowing out of democracy over the last 30, 40 years. And then there's a third set of problems which are threats not only to democracy but to all life on the planet, relating to climate change, nuclear proliferation, and kind of increased sort of potentials for international tension and conflict, which may be kind of catalyzed by those previous two factors. So populism is a problem. It's a political challenge. It is, as it were, the dark side of democracy, because populism basically, and I think Pierre Rosenvallon gets this right, populism is, as it were, the appeal to an element of the democratic ideal, popular sovereignty, against representative government. Okay, so suppose you think that democracy or the democratic ideal basically means something like the idea that the people who are governed in some sense also govern. Right? And you think that that means that in some sense the people govern as political equals. If we stopped our account of democracy there, then there would be no, in principle, objection to doing everything by plebiscite, governing through plebiscite, which is of course precisely what the sort of populist position is. The reason that's a problem is that it forgets that the people are also plural. And in failing to recognize the plurality of the people, and typically in wanting to kind of reject certain groups as not properly part of the people, whether it's immigrants or others, it attacks what is, the third core essential element of the democratic ideal. It's also, at the same time, giving us a narrative, what you might call a delegitimation narrative. So all politics and all democratic politics requires a kind of legitimacy story. It requires a story that tells us why being ruled as we are in this way through representative government, whatever, is a legitimate way in which the people are in some sense ruling themselves. Okay. Populism is giving us a delegitimation narrative. It's a claim to reject the structures of representation we have, say that the representation is inauthentic, that the representation, that parties are agents of government but not agents of representation in any meaningful sense. And that constructs a problem for the populists, which is a question about how they can claim to represent. Okay. Which is why you get in populist rhetoric always the appeal to, as it were, the ordinary person in the street, or what decent people would think. But that's, you know, the core of their view, their anti-representation and the kind of mediation of plurality that happens through representation. Part of the problem we have is that there's an element of truth to the populist diagnosis, which is that the age of the mass political party, where the party mediated between society and the state, where the party served to reconcile popular and constitutional government, or popular and constitutional democracy, looks like it is over. We don't have parties playing that kind of role anymore. And with kind of highly professionalized parties fairly disconnected from any kind of, you know, mass social base, the question of are parties representing is actually a serious one. So let's take an example. In the context of the Brexit referendum, one issue is about people voting for Brexit as a protest, not against a particular party, but as a protest against, as it were, Westminster party governments, as having essentially ignored them for 30 plus years. Or if we think about Rust Belt America and the extent to which, you know, they experience themselves as being ignored by the mainstream political parties. Now, you know, these are not the only groups, and there are lots of other groups involved in supporting populism for a diversity of reasons. But at least some of these reasons relate back to groups who feel that their interests, you know, their communities, their ways of life have not been, as it were, valued or given appropriate support or expression. Now, this is obviously, you know, kind of just a crude gloss on, you know, what is a more complicated picture. But I think one of the sort of real challenges we have is, in order to sort of sustain representative government, we need to kind of rethink parties, party organisation. That may also require rethinking electoral systems in some contexts, but it also means trying to kind of work out how civic and sort of social movement activity that takes place outside of, as it were, you know, the representative institutions can be reconnected up to those institutions, not in the sense that subordinates them to it, but so that there is some kind of mutual interaction and connection between the kind of groups that supported Occupy in various ways and those institutions, so that we don't have two things where they're both saying that the other is essentially irrelevant. So how can they kind of link up? That's a genuine problem to which I don't have a, you know, adequate response. But one part of developing a response would be to recognise how little we know, and particularly how little we know about how ordinary citizens think about politics, okay, and how they think about parties, political issues. I mean, you know, we have opinion polls, but what we don't have is kind of ethnographies of communities, particularly disadvantaged and alienated communities who perhaps haven't had high levels of voting rates, of how they picture politics, what they expect from politics, what they kind of expect politicians to be like, or, you know, how they think politicians should connect to them. So a kind of starting point would be for us actually to kind of try and listen to and engage with groups to get a much better sense of how citizens quite variably and diversely may think about politics, because different groups may think about politics in very different ways. So just a kind of descriptive mapping, in a sense, would be a sensible first task. Politicians, I think, on the whole, have very little sense, as do academics, of how, as it were, citizens conceive of their activity. So that's obviously a biggish question to start.